I think that we should get started, if I may. A very warm welcome to you all to this event on pivoting markets and trade towards sustainability, equity and well-being. My name is Bernice Lee. I'm the Health and Distinguished Fellow for Sustainability here at Chatham House. I'm happy to say that this is my second meeting today already here, except that last time I was well on the left over there, and right now I'm well on the right here, which I wonder whether or not that says something about the meeting and where I situate on the day, on the panel itself in some ways. Yeah, well, I think you've got a good one, definitely. Now, today we have a packed agenda, and States and Markets happen to be my favorite book by Susan Strange, which look at lots of different structures of power. And today we're going to look at how that interfaces with different concepts around justice, particularly, of course, in the context of this meeting about trade, sustainability and justice. But of course, these concepts are often loaded and important. And just this morning, because we were talking about ChatGPT and climate finance, we of course talked a lot about different ways through which we understand what is right, what is accurate, what is integrity. So I kind of started off this morning my other meetings remarks by saying that integrity is often comprising of three things that we think about, intentionality, accuracy, and then transparency. And there's no question that issues around justice cut across all of the above, because we're going to be talking today about different ways to explore these important concepts and how that situates us within the trade and sustainability regimes as well. We're talking obviously not least north-south, but also east-west, but also haves and have-nots, but also producers and consumers, but also today and yesterday, and certainly future generation as well at the same time. So what we have today is an excellent panel that will take us through some of the thinking around climate justice, a framework around trade and sustainability, and my colleagues will explain that further, but also of course the question around green swans, as you will see that in some of your material that you've seen as well. And what we'll do today is we'll start with Dorothy Grace Guerrero, who is Head of Policy at Global Justice Now and a trustee of London Mining Network as well. And she will talk to us about climate justice and the transition agenda. And then we'll have Chiago Kanashiro Uhara, who's a research fellow here at Chatham House as Environment and Society Program. And he will talk about this Planetary Welfare State Framework, and he will be WellCare Framework, he kept saying, which is part of an ongoing discussion. He will explain a bit the context of where that comes from. And then after that, we will have John Elkington, who, I'm just trying to figure out whether or not he needs to be introduced, but of course he does. He's founder and chief pollinator of Volans. In fact, I had the pleasure of doing some work with John in the last year or so, and have always been amazed by the ability he has in terms of connecting questions around states, markets, but also obviously the broader questions about welfare and well-being and governance as well. So that's what we would do today. We would do probably, if all of them are as good as I think they are, they will stick to the time that we have allocated for each of them, which is about, I did suggest that it should never be 8 to 10 minutes. You should always be told that you'll have 5 to 7 when you're aiming for 8 to 10. So we'll do the best we can to sort of aim within obviously 8 to 10 minutes. And then that should leave us with lots of time, because we have a nice snug environment here where we could have more discussion as well, hopefully later. So if I may ask Dorothy for you to kick us off as well with your remarks, please.
That's why I'm having this, so that I can look at it from time to time, so as not to go over time. So, well, my background is coming from a social movement and NGO campaign background, and we look at the question of trade, investments, at the same time.
I just want to make sure our colleagues in the tech space can help us. So one of our online participants is saying that he doesn't have, or she doesn't have audio to their end, so I just want to make sure that everyone can hear it. And I think Ogeshi Ike, you suggest from Oak Foundation, I think you said you couldn't hear us, so I just want to make sure that if you could let us know so that we can figure it out. Hopefully we could. Yeah, thanks.
Can she hear now? Or?
I don't know. Oh, she can now. Someone else said that they could. Other people could, so hopefully it's not us. It's I'm afraid. Yeah, okay, you may have to figure it yourself. Please.
Okay, so I hope it's smooth from now on.
Yeah.
Well, when you talk about climate or climate justice and also the need for just transition, we'll go back to the basic reality, that the fundamental reality on climate change and addressing it is that the global majority had very little responsibility of it, but at the same time they are already feeling the brunt of it, the impacts of climate change. And when we talk about addressing climate change, it is also important, especially to know that many of those countries in the global south are already paying for it in terms of allocating massive resources that they could have used on other services like education or health, but instead they have to address the climate issues. We think of Pakistan, for example, in the news. There's about flood and the disaster, but at the same time, not much about footprints and what they need to do about it. At the moment, they're looking at $4 billion to be able to recover, and where will that get that money from? They're being pressured to take more loans. So in that aspect, there's a very strong link with climate debt, while at the same time, many of the countries in the global south would rather also wanted to talk about climate debt of the north to the southern countries. Actually, in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the principle of climate debt was already raised as way back 2007, 2008, but that was not put on the table, but they went ahead and talked about loss and damage finance instead, which was agreed in the last UN meeting in Sharm el-Sheikh. So in the last IPCC report, there was also, for the first time, a mention that colonialism and climate change are very well linked. And it took the IPCC almost 3 decades to acknowledge that, but the global majority know that for a fact. And also, another emerging consensus is that if we wanted to address climate change, we have to keep fossil fuels on the ground, which is another laudable idea. But of course, the question of who will do it first, and at the same time, what kind of technologies will be needed for it, and the question of who controls those technologies, and also, will that be done in an orderly manner or in a chaotic manner is also important to discuss. The current efforts of partnerships between governments and multilateral bodies at the moment do not match the urgency of the enormity of the present challenges. And on the side of civil society, NGOs, and various groups as well, many of the efforts even from trade unions, are simply not yet broad enough or strong enough to take the task at hand. So that's why there's always the need for participation of civil society in all the major multilateral meetings. So the key question now is, which powers or entities are capable of delivering the kind of just transition that we need? And when we talk about just transition, it's not just about job creation, because there are also issues of which resources are we talking about. We talk about it, it's already, there's a consensus that it is important to transition to renewable energies, but then there's also the question of those critical minerals that are mostly located as well in the developing countries, in the global south, which is also recreating the same kind or much worse kind of injustices, destructive extractivism, and that is an important issue that must be acknowledged and discussed. There's also the issue of trade and finance not being neutral. We might think it is neutral, but at the same time, we could see that the global rules that govern them, if we look at it historically, had been a tool of the powerful to produce and ensure relations of inequality, submission, appropriation, and also the most demonstrable outcome of which is, again, indebtedness of the global south. Unequal trade relations, actually, from the feminist perspective, reinforces the most diverse of asymmetries between actors, also at different levels and different scale. And at the same time, it shows as well how these diverse patterns of domination traverses class, race, gender, coloniality, and societal nature relations. So those are key principles that we have to put in mind when we talk about policies, what pathways do we need to think about when we wanted to say we're building a climate just transition? Those who remember structural adjustment policies in the past would remember how those policies are imposed. And how some countries, or many countries in the developing South, were express it as being a bitter pill. But the thing is, bitter pill, you know that there will be a good resolution of your ailment. But this bitter pill did not improve the economy. It put them more and more into debt, and at the same time put at the end of that unequal trade relations. In Africa, Latin America, and Asia, there's also a growing demand for debt cancellation and also the structural reform of the economic world order that is also getting popular. And at the same time, the indigenous people are getting more stronger also in giving their perspective when it comes to sustainability. Because after all, their praxis showed that 80% of the remaining biodiversity are found in indigenous territories worldwide that are more organized than those areas where there's no indigenous organizations or organized indigenous populations. So they're talking from their praxis. When we talk about also of what are the elements in this just transition, it's not just about monetary compensation. Although in the negotiation, in the UN climate negotiation, it is important to put a price on how much the global South needed to address the challenge of loss and damage. But compensation or monetary element is important, but there's also the importance of stopping the harm. And this is where I will go back to keeping fossil fuels on the ground. But then, of course, the whole question of keeping fossil fuels on the ground would needed a kind of global agreement. And that is why what is on the table now, what is proposed by Vanuatu and other countries about the fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty might be one example of how that transition can be, how just transition can be in a more orderly manner if all the states will sit together and decide how that fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty will be realized. Of course, just transition I already mentioned, but then also systemic alternatives. Many movements have discussed about systemic alternatives in terms of various elements. You have the right for nature, or right of nature in Latin America. On the more legal aspect, for example, South Africa have already put in their constitution the right to say no to destructive extractivism. They're also putting climate justice in their constitution as well. In the constitutions of Ecuador, it's already instated there about the right of nature as well. So there are those alternatives. There are alternatives about making trade different, looking at trade in a way that will address the needs of people. And also, I think part of the just transition principle as well is that when we talk about the need to what is the basic need, and at the same time in the North we have to fast track it. We need to do the transition here in a immediate, at the same time just manner. But in the global South there is still under development or maldevelopment in the South. So they're also talking about how can we go about realizing more sustainable development, or at least increasing the standard of living in the South. It's not just based on GNP, but more of really addressing welfare and addressing more life, a kind of living that is fit for humans and not just on the GNP. On the fossil fuel sector, of course, we at the moment there's no agreement in the UN on what to do with oil. There is a mention about coal, but all these sectors is not yet prepared for phasing out. And actually, this discussion should have happened 3 decades ago. And now that it is badly needed, also in the situation where you have energy crisis, the best way to actually address energy crisis is how do we transition to more renewable source of energy. while acknowledging all this, we also need to consider that the increase on demand for critical raw materials have to take in hand who owns them, where are they located, how are we extracting them. And there are measures, for example, in Latin America, where they are saying, okay, we will let you extract it, but at a price which is good for us as well, because we have to end that kind of relationship where raw materials are cheap to produce cheap products, and also the question of, even if we transition to renewable energy, what will that energy be used for? What will be the priorities? There are many instances, for example, in the Mekong region. I lived in Thailand for 10 years, where countries in Laos and Cambodia could see the cable passing their village while they don't have electricity. And those electricity are just used to light up and make air-conditioned malls in Bangkok, four air-conditioned malls with 2 dams that are operating. So I think this issue of what do we mean when we say energy poverty, energy security, what it will be used for, what's the priority, these are important questions.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much, Dorothy. Just sort of as you were speaking, it reminded me of, obviously, I started off on climate justice, but not necessarily on the trade side. And the interesting thing, of course, at the moment is that no one in the North is defending trade either, because the sort of antipathy against trade is now shared globally. And I wonder whether or not, if indeed one wants to pick an opportunity out of a crisis. I mean, by the way, it's hard not to start any meeting without listing the list of crises we are under at the moment. But perhaps this is an opportunity, therefore, for us to rebuild and rethink some of this. And I've written a lot, I mean, many people in the room probably has written a lot of work around, how the World Trade Organization has been an organization in search of a mission for quite some time, on the basis that when the core function of an organization such as WTO, which was about liberalization and open markets, is in doubt, it hasn't really found an alternative raison d'etre that really help us ground thinking around how best to use institutions of that sort, especially when you are in the poly-crisis that also shook the faith in international institutions as well, generally speaking. Now, that may be a good place for us to segue into Thiago's Planetary Care Welfare State Framework, where you're going to explain to us sort of the thinking and the concept around which, and also the background to this framework as well. That'll be really helpful. So Thiago, please, your 10 minutes, or 8 to 10 minutes.
Thank you, Bernice. And also thanks for the AV with this Planetary WellCare. I'll distract you for 10 minutes and play the role today of a nerd researcher, basically working on some high-level conceptualizations of sustainability, justice, and as it is, or as it can be applied to trade. So as an overall context, the idea of the Planetary WellCare, if I had 2 key elements in this framework that I would highlight, is twofold. At first, I'm using the word WellCare to potentially steer us away from the idea of welfare states, which is often only afforded by high-income countries. And also, when I add the planetary to the WellCare idea, I draw attention to 2 things. One, in welfare, we normally focus on economic and social elements of a system, and the economic provisions that would facilitate the life of citizens of a certain country. And that's where planetary comes in. So I'm talking about a framework that would help states to care for beings, creatures, geographies, ecologies that are outside of a jurisdiction. So it's not self-centered, it's not about the citizens of an affluent geography. So those are the 2 points. If I move next, basically the 10 minutes I'll cover where this idea came from and where we're heading towards. So the work is funded by the UK Research and Innovation, and it's part of Trade Hub, which is an alliance of 50 organizations across the world, including institutions in the UK, in Europe, but also researchers and institutions all over the tropics, including Indonesia, Brazil, Cameroon, Ghana. And collectively, we work on an agenda for just and sustainable trade. And one of the elements that Chatham House was commissioned to help steer a conversation was to find ways to frame our understanding of sustainability as it is applied to trade. And as you can see in this show of words, there are plenty of frameworks related to sustainability. Most of them would tackle environmental sustainability. For some of our partners, sustainable trade would have to do with preserving a particular species in a particular country, like pangolin in Ghana, for instance. For others, that would have to do with a more, I would say, radical approach of degrowth. For some, or the majority, that would be fundamentally based on views of eco-modernism. But the question we had in the beginning was how to bring 50 organizations from the Global North and the Global South in a common framing of sustainability and justice as it can be applied to trade. So as Dorothy mentioned, we have in Ecuador the idea of buen vivir. We have from the Global South ideas of civilizational transitions towards the pluriverse. We have ecofeminism. We have the donut economics. So how can we, as a collective of 50 organizations, can address sustainability and justice in trade? So we started working with ideas of the triple bottom line, understanding how it can be applied to trade, same for the donut economics, but observing also elements that would come from the Global South in framing the elements of cultural diversity and ecological diversity, and ideas of trying not to impose onto the majority world a framework designed primarily by the Security Council of the UN. And we also processed elements that comes from planning scholars in framing sustainability as a set of 5 equity principles for sustainable development that goes beyond the classic intergenerational, intragenerational equity and interspecies or ecological sustainability aspects to bring elements of geographical equity and elements of procedural equity. So how do we go about policymaking in trade? Who has a say in shaping what is relevant to trade policies? Who decides on what is the kinds of choices we have when we go to our local market to source our supplies? And in this main element that it's in the next slide, basically what we decided was to connect with 3 basic elements of several sustainability frameworks, including some coming from indigenous sustainability science, which is to focus on strong or true sustainability. I won't delve into the details of the economics of it, but that's one of the pillars. The other is to understand sustainability as a set of 5 equity principles for sustainable development, as I just mentioned, and also understand that sustainability ought to be plural. There's no one single vision of sustainability that would be suitable to different cultures and different ecologies. And if you allow me, as I said, I would be the nerd in the room. We are talking about dreams. We are talking about how we can engage with better futures. And in the way we theoretically conceptualized systems and what needs to change in trade and economies is in a very high level here. So trade systems can only be deemed successful when regenerative, distributive, equitable and plural, thus respecting ecological and social boundaries, therefore speaking to the donut economics, embodying equity in processes and outcomes while accommodating for the coexistence of multiple trading systems, formal and informal, at all levels, from the local to the global. Highly theoretical. I apologize again, the nerd in the room. And the way we put it together so far is in the idea of a WellCare framework, or the Planetary WellCare Framework. So it brings, instead of a focus for trade policies on improving a trade balance or having more exports or pushing or encouraging the least developed or the low-income countries to increase their exports, which is currently in the Sustainable Development Goals framing. We basically are trying to integrate the low-income countries into global economies and not necessarily observing the other development needs. So in a way, the well in the WellCare framework just calls for a rethink in the focus on economic growth, GDP growth, to something that would be fundamentally wired into a system that would deliver into the well-being of all. And in their well-being, if you go straight into the paper, there is a clear definition of the aspects of life we are talking about. And when we talk about well-being, we're not only mentioning the physical or material well-being. We're talking about community well-being. We're talking about emotional well-being. So it's quite comprehensive. The C for WellCare is what is often neglected in sustainable trade frameworks. We don't talk about overconsumption. In green strategies, we talk about greenifying trade, but we don't address the very foundations of consumerism. So there is a need for a convergence between what is going on in terms of high affluent societies and also help improve the consumption levels of communities who would do better if they consumed better and more. Accountability across borders is also a very basic element in terms of when we think sustainability, but most important is for us to observe that the current metrics on sustainable trade have often been observing production-based accountability metrics, and therefore often blaming, I would say, producing countries like Indonesia for what they produce, even if what is produced there is consumed in Singapore, Japan, or China. So in the mainstream sustainable trade index we have today available on the internet, basically there is a bonus for those consuming deforestation in Indonesia, and we blame Indonesia for that feature. R is for reconciliation between international and place-based policymaking, therefore calling for not an attempt to universalize trade arrangements, but find ways to have a place-based processes where citizens are involved in the definitions of what's relevant for them in their search for improvement or maintenance of well-being levels. And E is for the classic environment. We're talking about biodiversity, ecological systems, which would basically call for embedding the idea of planetary health goals into systems that are conventionally wired into measures of economic growth, trade balance, and profits. What is happening now? This is little WellCare is not the final one. I'm working with people doing a better design for the idea of WellCare. And we are working in this group of 50 organizations through Trade Hub to create action tracks to deliver on the 5 elements that I just discussed previously, and also try to identify nation states and fora where this kind of approach could be influential and potentially frame new ways of engaging with trade policymaking. So that's my presentation for now. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, and thank you for highlighting for us as well the set of high-level principles that we can draw certain inspiration, if not specific direct action right now from. It just suddenly dawned on me what happened is that when my colleagues gave me the prep notes, they all says welfare, because I think that autocorrect actually did the job. So perhaps this is one of the challenges. We have the nomenclature is often one of the first challenge. And there are lots of questions also beginning to come in as well that we will come through as soon as the paper will be available, I believe, if there is a paper available. But I think before further ado, though, I think we should go to John before we go to more questions and stuff. I mean, you've heard the comments so far. Your question is, how can you pivot green swans, which is your thing, in market operations and Planetary WellCare Framework and trade policy? How do we take what we know in terms of businesses and the possibility of maybe, if not silver bullets, a certain greener bullets, within the framework that we're talking about? And a lot of questions that are coming through from the audience is really, online audience is really about the whole question around balancing between rich and poor, have and have-nots, for example. So please, John, take it away.
Well, thanks, Bernice, and good afternoon, everyone. I'll try and keep my comments short so that we can get into the discussion fairly quickly. I think the ambition of a common framework is a sensible one, but I don't underestimate the complications and the challenges of getting to a mutually agreed framework. You think about the Sustainable Development Goals. I have a very simple brain. I can remember 3 things. 5, I start to struggle. 17, I'm just completely lost at sea with all hands. And I think the reason I'm on this panel is that way back in almost 40 years, in 1994, I came up with the idea, already referenced, the triple bottom line. And that wasn't designed to be an absolute framework for all time. It was a provocation. What would it be like if instead of thinking just about profit, you thought about the social and the environmental elements of whatever you're doing? Primarily at that stage, business and financial institutions, although one of the more interesting things I'm doing at the moment is working with a mayoral candidate, a woman who's running for mayor in Toronto, and she's using the triple bottom line framework there. So the first thing to say is I think a framework would be a good idea. I think it's going to be complicated. And I think we're at the moment in our global evolution where we have a sort of Tower of Babel in this space, where you, Tiago, had a slide with some of the different terms. And I often say to people at the moment, if you think that's the problem and you think it's going to get better anytime soon, I absolutely don't think that's the case, because as this whole agenda of ours messily, noisily, and in a more and more politicized form mainstreams, absolutely everyone on their donkey is going to want to have their own jargon, their own branding, their own positioning. So the complexity is going to get a lot worse, I believe. So I think having some sort of outline framework, I think is good, because it acts as a focus for conversation, and I think that is enormously useful. And I think the focus on the global south is absolutely critical at this particular moment in time. Justice. When I think back at the work that I've done over the decades, justice has been there, but it's often been environmental justice rather than social justice. I've worked with human rights and anti-bribery and corruption organizations and so on, but it's been environmental justice. But if you start to think about what's happening on that space, for example, 3M, DuPont, Forever Chemicals, one of these things where suddenly what was originally defined as a local or regional issue in Texas or whatever, where around chemical plants you had clusters of cancers, is now something that in all of our bodies worldwide, Forever Chemicals are present. So several things are happening at the same time. The first is this agenda is being felt by ordinary people in a way that it once would not have been, particularly around climate change. I mean, it's, because I've been working on this for so long, it's quite a shock to me now to find ordinary people who are quite happy to entertain a conversation around climate change. And I think that's exciting, but they don't yet know quite what to do with it. They don't know how to bring that into their voting or consumption or whatever it happens to be. Bernice mentioned the polycrisis. And again, we're at one of those moments where I think a lot of people are thinking, this is a mess. It's going to get better sometime soon. You mentioned Green Swans. I did a book by that title, 2020 it came out. And the first diagram, first illustration in the book is what I call the U-bend. And basically what I was arguing was that we have all grown up in a macroeconomic and geopolitical system that is inherited from our parents and grandparents and was put together in the wake of the Second World War, because people then had no option, they felt, but to sacrifice a certain amount of sovereignty and create trade regimes that worked to some degree for all. I think those regimes are now decomposing, and I think that process will accelerate. And I was saying just before we came on stage this afternoon, I was in Madrid last week and was saying there that I think what's happening in Ukraine at the moment, and I wish this was not true, is pretty much the equivalent of the Spanish Civil War. So beyond that conflict, there is an even bigger one coming towards us. So when we think about changing trade regimes or whatever it is, I think we have to be aware that the world is not necessarily going in ways that we would like it to go. And one of the projects I'm doing at the moment is with the armed forces in this country. And I've been talking to a number of people who've been looking at climate change through the lens of what are the implications for the military in this country. Forced migration, all these different aspects starting to come through. So towards the conclusion, if we talk about pivoting, we tend to assume that we're in control and we can decide to pivot. So let's discuss how we do it. I think we're moving into a period where pivots of all sorts will be forced on us. And then the question is, how do you bring together constellations, clusters, critical mass of different actors to make change happen? And my final point is I'm actually quite optimistic. May not sound as though I should be, but I actually think there are moments in our collective history where an old order melts down, and it's only then that if you're really wanting to do major things, system changes, we've got used to calling it, that suddenly becomes possible. But by God, you have to have a clear blueprint, and you have to have the political will to make that happen enough.
Thank you, John. And also I thank you particularly because, unbeknownst to you, you have answered one of the questions that Matthew Davis posed to you specifically around, do we have enough chaos now, John? He read your book, obviously. There are two quotes here saying that you often write about how chaos bred opportunities. And his question was specifically about whether or not we have enough chaos, and also whether the cohort or cadre of future lit leaders would emerge.
Can I go back to that, Bernice? Just simply say, no, we do not yet have enough chaos, because no normal people and their leaders are not yet prepared to sacrifice sovereignty or to do things that are currently unimaginable. So I'm afraid the pain has to build somewhat further.
Well, thank you. And what I would prefer to do, if I may, is to take a few thoughts from the room and then go back to online. There are quite a few questions, which I can forewarn the panelists about now a little bit. There's obviously a question about the whole question about fossil fuel, the justice of it, that, rich countries exploited theirs. Now they're telling others not to. Not surprisingly, these are the questions. Are the current regimes, from climate to others, fit for purpose, conducive to the Planetary WellCare Framework, for example? So these are some of the questions that we may go back to, and I'm just giving you a forewarning so that you can prep. And also, it's also not the first time we've had a conversation about rejigging trade rules. I've practically built a career on it in the past. So the question then is, how can we ensure that we can do better this time, maybe? But with that, can I take some thoughts from the room as well? Should we take one or two, maybe? Okay, so one here and one there for now. So to the right, person in maroon.
Thank you. I'm a member of Chatham House. I was interested in this one heading out of all those that you...
Would you give us your name as well, sir?
Peter Hurst.
Yeah.
That you gave us about balancing consumerism, because I feel if we really want to balance consumerism, then we'll lose the battle against climate change, because, particularly in the global south, they do have the advantage of good weather, and we don't have that in the north. So, there is a possibility of well-being being equal, but consumerism being unequal. And if we put the priority on well-being rather than consumerism, then we might find it a little bit easier to tackle these challenges. Thank you.
Thank you. And the person at the back as well, and then we'll come back to you.
Yeah, hi, my name is Omar. There's a particular thing that...
tell us who you are, perhaps.
Pardon?
Sorry, I'm being a terrible chair. Please tell us your name and what you do, and if you may, you don't have to, but it's usually help us all understand where each other comes from. Yeah.
Okay. So my name is Omar. I'm a student at SOAS, University of London, and I study global development and international relations. So there's one thing that stuck out to me, which out of everything, which was the example of Bjorn Viver that was given. As an example for the global south and the direction this should be taken. So these are two different things that are basically I see them as kind of opposites. So the whole issue of consumerism, that's obviously in the global north, as right now we're in a high consumerist age in the global north. And in the global south, we tend to have the conversation dominated as in more post-development type of approaches. So how realistic is it to have the global south subscribe to these post-development approaches, and at the same time, how realistic is it for the global north to reel back on this consumerism?
Anyone want to take this on? No?
I'm happy to have a quick go, because I think consumerism is pernicious, except that it does give people broadly what they're persuaded that they want. And we live in consumerist societies in the global north. And in the late 80s, I did a book called The Green Consumer Guide, which sold 1 million copies in 18 months. Had a huge impact on business at the time. You can play that game, but you can't play it for very long because consumers do not want to pay attention. They do not want to be anxious or fearful for very long. So they'll act for a short period of time, then they'll go back to sleep. But if I think about the global south and its development trajectory, I find it very hard, and it's probably a personal problem, to imagine how that will happen without consumerism being a very key part of the mix. Because of global advertising and all the rest of it, people have been persuaded over a very long time that there is a very particular aspirational future that they should be embracing. How you break that, or how you put us onto a different trajectory, is not entirely clear to me. So at SOAS or wherever, if you're working on elements of that, I'd love to hear more.
I actually wanted to emphasize as well, coming from what you mentioned, consumption and production are both sides of the same coin when we talk about climate, because the way things are produced, the way they are shipped all over the world, the way that design obsolescence is part of our day-to-day consumerism must be addressed. But then at the same time, the whole question of that production and consumption, and also the kind of capitalism we have now is no longer the competitive type. I've spent a lot of years campaigning against neoliberal policies, but what we have at the moment is actually monopoly corporations. From the time we wake up and sleep, most of the things that we need are actually controlled, owned, dictated by less and less numbers of corporations. So be it on food, be it on energy or transportation, even data, these are all getting more and more controlled by less and less numbers. So and we need to understand that, to be able to understand what kind of world we are living in and how do we make policies that will address those questions. Second, when we talk about trade, there is also those ideas from institutions that one size fits all, and that we have resisted in the South, that not everything is one size fits all, because there are various needs of different countries. And when we talk about trade as well, there is an asymmetry of power between states, corporations, and communities. Like at the moment, as we speak now, there are powers that are available to corporations, especially transnational corporations, because even if countries don't like trade anymore, but they still subscribe and sign free trade agreements that have those investment policies in them that say, for example, corporations can sue governments if there are policies or laws that governments will start that will harm their profits. So in the Energy Charter Treaty that we are still part of, in the Investment State Dispute Settlement that we still signing on as states, this gives so much power to corporations that they can do or effect a policy freeze or policy chill and stop governments, for example, even if they say we will stop mining, but then they will be sued by mining corporations because of those trade rules. And those are the things that we need to change.
Thank you for that. I mean, I have a questioner here that is rather insistent that I will read out the question in full. So I think I will, because I'm a bit terrified of the machine barking orders at me right now, which is to say, actually, that's unfair. That's not really barking, really. It's just very gently insisting, which is to say that talking about sustainable trade is for you, Thiago, as I understand. You're the second panelist. Oh, yeah, that's you, yeah. Talking about sustainable trade should benefit both sides. What do you think of what's happening in reality, especially in developing countries which are very vulnerable to climate change?
In reality, and I would focus on the element of consumerism being embedded in the current dominant trade regime. So both in the WTO system and also in the SDGs, there's still a push for consumerism to drive improvement in other areas of life. And if we don't talk about this very element when we address economic systems, trade systems, we won't go much farther. I mentioned, for instance, the EU Green Economy Plan. It doesn't mention consumerism or overconsumption. And when we have a look at the most progressive frameworks addressing trade, like the Canadian one, or even the International Fair Trade Charter, which advocates for fair trade, justice, and strong sustainability, there's very little in it that really tackles the system that is ultimately encouraging more production, more consumption as a way to alleviate poverty and potentially minimizing negative impacts on biodiversity and climate, but is always driven by this push for economic growth. So yeah, it's precisely consumption is one of the keys. And in terms of a divide between global north and south, I wouldn't say there is a divide when it comes to thinking equity and sustainability in trade frameworks. It's precisely institutions and organizations based in the global south that have been calling for change in trade regimes that would enable them to develop capacities and a proper governance regime, so they wouldn't be open for grabs or open for phases of rapid extraction of resources that would be flown into the consumption once driven by us, for example, in this room. Sorry?
No, please. Oh, no.
Okay. When it comes to what is happening now, is primarily there's a uber neglect of the element of, in several geographies, there is a need for capping consumption. And even, I would say most of the leading companies in the UK and beyond, they are very clear in stating that there's so much voluntary standards can do. There's so much that we as a multinational can do in this global system where the lowest price is the lead, where selling more is what is driving companies in their contributions to economic growth. And they, compared to what was happening in the 80s, today, even these bigger companies leading on issues of regeneration, distribution, sustainability, and justice, they are calling for better regulations. And I do understand this is the time for us to think about better regulations for trade.
Thank you. What I would like to do, if I may, is to take the question from the person in the middle, and then I want to read you all the good questions I'm hearing, and then I'll leave the panelists to decide how to answer, which one you want to pick to answer, okay? So if I can take the question in the room, please. Thank you. All the thoughts in the room.
Thank you very much. Sarah Dunn, I'm the Managing Director at Apt Associates. So we do work on climate and range of social issues around the world. I was turning to John, actually, because I do get the don't waste a good crisis, and that's the only way you're going to stimulate major change. But I wanted a bit more hope than that, because we're working on this now. And I just wondered, if you had to pick your top 3 things we should focus on now, what would they be?
Great. So what I'm going to do now is to give you a sense of what the questions are from the online audience. And as I mentioned already, there was one about, developed countries used fossil fuel for development, now preaching to others to abandon the fossil for producing energy. Developing countries are aware of the problems of fossil fuels. They will join the developed countries when they are ready for alternatives. How do you deal with this issue? How do you propose that we deal with this issue? I also mentioned the question around the current architecture for international agreement on climate change in Paris. Is it conducive to achieving WellCare? Also, the question, which actually my favorite one, is how do you engage the youth in the global south to be part of this pivot or shift, especially in countries where freedom of expression and political expressions could be limited or are limited, it says here. I was editorializing as I was reading it out, which is not good, is it? As we search for alternative discourses and the new paths of thinking, of exposing subjugated knowledge or epistemic deficit and developing concepts and categories of sustainability, what do we think of rethinking the whole process of education from a critical constructivist approach? And then some hope? Is there some hope? There's a different vein of question. Is there some hope to be derived from the fact that many of the oil-producing countries, especially in the Gulf, are using many of the petrodollars gleaned from digging fossil fuels out to invest in green and clean technologies that will take over when the oil finally runs out? And last but not least, what tools should cultural institutions be using? Need move faster than confident choice of what to do? And would it be possible for things to, well, some of the changes organizations in the global south are demanding as well? So, you know, you see that you're stimulating a very broad set of questions and reactions. And you now all probably have about 1.5 minutes each, which is always good to focus minds in general. On the basis that I think John answered more than others, so you're going to get least time. Okay, and then we'll move here, then we'll add time at the end. So John, why don't you do that?
Well, just those 3 questions that you kindly asked. None of my suggestions is going to be short term. And the first one is transform economics, which is a huge task. And people like Kate Rayworth and Mariana Mazzucato and so on are working on that front. And I think that's incredibly important. The second is that most of our movements are focused on the old order companies. We're not focusing on people doing precision fermentation, artificial intelligence, all of these different emergent technologies. I've started to go and see people like DeepMind and so on to understand better what they're doing. And when I ask them, who are you seeing from the AI or the sustainability or the justice or whatever movements, the answer is almost no one. So we've really got to get into those spaces where people are building unicorn companies or whatever to create a very different future and influence them now. The third thing is we're going to have to think about something absolutely inconceivable at the moment. And that is, if you go back to slavery, where the UK government bought out the property rights to slaves over 2 years and spent 40% of GDP to do it. We're going to have to buy out, to some degree, the fossil fuel polluters, and we're going to have to criminalize the rest. So not something we're going to do in short order, but I think we're going to have to do it. And just finally, on the youth question, I think youth would have every excuse now to become extremely angry by what's happening. I just read a book called How to Blow Up a Pipeline by Andreas Malm. And some of you will have seen the film. I think the time is coming quite quickly where people start to go for the infrastructure of the fossil fuels sector. That will not necessarily be wildly positive, but I think that will happen. That was more than 1.5 minutes, but there we go.
Good. Dorothy, can you go next?
Well, I would like to also start from hope. Where's hope? Well, the thing is that to me, what is very exciting is that, one, you have the global consensus that climate change is happening. It's a global issue and it needs global solidarity to address it. So that's very, very important. Of course, there's a challenge of how do we actually address it? Where will we start? But there are also all those answers already. Stop fossil fuels, and also what you mentioned, yes, energy is a security issue. And what is nice about the youth movement now, there was an event where Fridays for Future, for example, talked something about the NATO. So movements are not just one issue campaign at the moment. They're starting to link the issue of climate change with the economy, with security, with politics and democracy. And I think these are the last item that I mentioned is very, very important because yes, it's economic questions and economics, politics is concentrated economics, but then there's all those desires and to find an alternative economic, the way we do our economics, and all those alternatives that are already actually not just being discussed in the global south, they are being lived, they're being experienced. Arundhati Roy said they are pulsating and alive. So those questions of when we veer, those questions of looking at what is important, what is the living economy that we should aspire for, those are being practiced already. There are communities of resistance, they are resisting. Yes, they are being suppressed, but they are resisting. Those are also important because the first step in finding an alternative is to say no to all the wrongs that are happening at the moment. By saying no, then you will start to find the answer. Why you're saying no, that's analysis, and what do you want to make it right?
Great, thank you so much, Charity. I mean, now, Diego, you can take us home as well, because some of the questions that were just read out, for example, how explain some of the changes organizations in the Global South are demanding, how these sets of principles, WellCare Framework, could help satisfy some of the demand as well, meet some of the demand would be helpful.
Okay. I'll start with the need for us to revisit our indicators of success. So remember, we are talking about several dimensions of life, like emotional well-being beyond economic security, that we need to be serious about. And when we talk about sustainability, we're well aware that we are not talking only about net zero or climate neutrality. There's a plethora of justice and other environmental and economic dimensions that we need to bring back to our work. And for our audience and for myself, I keep reminding me what brought me to Chatham House and what made me work in the sustainability space, which is fundamentally based on justice, it's fundamentally based on better futures, it's fundamentally based on environmental stewardship. So if we're serious about those, we should always keep us on track to deliver on the highest standards when it comes to the well-being of everyone. And I just wanted to comment on a final thing on the elements of well-being, but I'm aware of time and maybe I should pass this on to you.
Go.
Okay, just commenting, there's a question on where is the paper, so I'll send or link in the presentation here. So the paper is available currently at Social Archive under the title Trade System Change, an interdisciplinary proposal for true sustainability and planetary health. And there you can find further definitions and conceptualizations of the boundaries of what would be each of the 5 principles for well-being, for consumption, for accountability, for redressing local with global, and for environmental stewardship. So over there you can find a more delineated and nuanced approach to the entire system that I'm proposing here for us to consider here and after. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Diego. I don't know about the audience, but I certainly feel that it's got me thinking a lot about the importance of thinking through principles so that we have frameworks that we can apply them and that can actually use them in the multidimensional way that was described, both bottom up, top down, sideways, in such a way, because all these issues, because of the interconnectedness, and perhaps because all of which have to be intermediated not only through states and markets, but also power structures. And that we can't forget any of that, really, as we think through how best to turn this set of principles of these sorts from inspiration into something that does guide daily life and help improve daily life, whether here or anywhere else in the world, but certainly not just this generation, but for the next as well. But with that, I hope that we all feel, as I do, that we have plenty of food for thoughts in terms of how to translate them into usable and helpful concepts, which we have plenty of today from the audience as well as our panelists. And with that, please join me in thanking our excellent panelists.